Hey everybody, it's Ryan from Pi Records, and I'm here with Mark from King Ghidora. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Um, so you're on Sharawazi Records, correct?
Yes.
And I'm guessing you have something new coming out.
Um, well, yes and no. There is an album that was recorded during 2020 and 2021, and that's kind of, we'll say it's in a holding pattern at the moment. We don't have an actual release date, but it's supposed to come out this year. Either on Sharwahi or King Ghidora Records.
Okay. Um, but I listened to your 2018 album, and I really enjoyed it. I like we were supposed to get together before, and I listened to it then, and I listened to it today. I listened to the whole thing straight through, and I loved it. I loved it, and I've been following you guys for a while, so I was a little intimidated about approaching you because you guys are so good.
Well, I appreciate that. But you don't have to worry about talking.
So tell me a little bit about how you describe your sound, and what kind of influences you have.
Well, as far as influences, which I think would explain the sound, I discovered surf music back in, I want to say, mid 1980s, when I was living in Maryland, and a lot of the, I guess a lot of the skate rock and a lot of the punk rock that I was listening to was kind of, it didn't seem like rock and roll to me. It seemed like it was based in some other form of music. And one of the older guys that I knew who was heavy into all the old school music, punk rock, all this stuff, he says, well, you know that at the time my favorite band was the Dead Kennedys, and he says, well, you know, the Dead Kennedys are basically just surf rock with vocals. And and I'm like, well, okay, what's surf rock? And then he introduced me to, of course, the Ventures, and then bands like Agent Orange.
Yeah.
And then I didn't really think about surf rock or even touch it for a very long time. And then I guess in the it would have been early 90s, I discovered Manor Astroman.
Yeah.
And when I discovered Manor Astroman, to me, it was like, so these guys are kind of like, they're sort of like a more technical, stranger version of the Dead Kennedys, but without the vocals. And then around that same time, I also discovered the band, the Jesus Lizard, which to me, at the time, my explanation of the Jesus Lizard was like, these guys are like the Dead Kennedys, but more technical. And then, of course, in the midst of all that was my other favorite band, all-time favorite band, is Sonic Youth.
Oh yeah.
And so when it came time to dive into surf music, as a project, I wanted to do something that was a cross between, like, if you could take Manor Astroman style surf music and meld that with elements of Jesus Lizard and Sonic Youth, and kind of, I don't want to say ditch the traditional approach, but try and expand on it in some way that, I don't want to say that hasn't been done, but that isn't typically done.
Yeah.
So as far as influences, early influences, it would be Jimi Hendrix, Dead Kennedys, Bad Brains, Sonic Youth, and then oddly enough, the Beastie Boys.
Oh man,
So,
I love the Beasties.
Our sound, if I had to, I mean, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm dead center Gen X. I mean, so for me, part of my litmus test when I first meet someone is I'll somewhere in the conversation I'll try to figure out what their stance is on the Beastie Boys, and I kind of go from there. And if I get I hate the Beastie Boys, all of a sudden I have a real conflict on my hands. So, and I guess I would probably you know what I mean? That's a tough call. It's a tough call there. And I guess since I spent all of the 1980s growing up in Maryland and then all of the 90s living in Charlotte, North Carolina, I would consider myself an East Coast kid. And East Coast kids from the 80s and the 90s, it was Bad Brains, Dead Kennedys, Fugazi, you know. Yeah. So all that stuff, whether I would have wanted it to or not, I think it would have crept its way into King Ghidora's sound.
It sounds especially influential to you because you were so close to the BC area.
Yes. So when all during the 1980s, all I did was ride skateboards. And my family and I, we lived on Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, which is about a 20-minute ride from Washington, D.C. Yeah. They call it Joint Base Andrews now, or something to that effect.
Okay.
But at the time, it was Andrews Air Force Base, and so if you hopped on the Washington Parkway from Andrews, it was only about 20 minutes to get to the smack dab in the middle of Washington, D.C. And so I spent every weekend of my life during the 1980s roaming around Washington, D.C., Georgetown area, skateboarding. And so all of that music was there. I mean, I would go down to, there's a place called Pulaski Park, which is a big open courtyard marble area. And if you were a skateboarder in DC, that was where you went. And I can remember many times being down there skateboarding and oh, hey, there's Ian MacKaye walking by, Of course, it would have been so uncool to run over and say, hi, Ian MacKaye. I'm a huge fan of Fugazi and I'm a skateboarder and you should like me, So anytime Ian MacKaye, you saw those guys, you just kind of acted like, yeah, it's no big deal. But of course it was a huge deal, So the scene in Maryland and DC in the 80s was, at least from a skateboarder's perspective, music wise, most of the skateboarders, especially my close friends, we were listening to punk rock, but then we were also listening to Public Enemy, Eric B. and Rakim, De La Soul. So in 1980s Maryland, skateboarders you couldn't really peg them down to a music genre. And if you were a skateboarder, you knew you kind of had to have these things in your collection. It was sort of like your membership card, So it was all cassettes back then. So if your buddy came over to hang out, the first thing they did was they looked at what skate videos you had, and then they went through your music collection, and it's like kind of check off the list of, okay, Bad Brains, Metallica, Dead Kennedys, Eric B. and Rakim, all the East Coast stuff back then. And a lot of it wasn't even East Coast, but it was kind of part of the outfit, so to speak, So yeah, I really loved being in Maryland and Washington, D.C. My family and I relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina right at the beginning of the 90s, which was a huge culture shock for me, to going from being an urban kid to living in a rural area, going to high school where there was one other skateboarder in my high school, and who ended up becoming my best friend, and he had just moved there from Texas. So at least I had another outcast to kind of go through it with. And oddly enough, he listened to all the same music as me, so it was like, instant click. But yeah, I'm sorry, I start talking and I get off on a rant about back to the original point. Yes, I think being close to DC and that music scene in the 1980s was pretty badass.
Yeah, I remember watching skate videos of Tony Hawk and Steve Caballero. And when I was young, I'd go to a friend's house, and the music on those old tapes was just, it was just very inspiring.
Yeah, I think, what's weird is I think that the marriage between music and skateboarding, those two things culturally, they're kind of one and the same, in the sense that a lot of the music that we're talking about sort of based in youth culture, kind of, I guess you could say counterculture. But most of the punk rock music, or just strange music in general, whether it was punk rock or metal or rap, at the time, it was called rap. Now it's hip hop or whatever. But
Yeah.
Most of that stuff I discovered through skate videos. The first time I ever heard Sonic Youth was on a Santa Cruz skateboards video, and it was the song Catholic Block by Sonic Youth. And at the time, even though I was heavy duty into all of this weird punk rock music, I was like, who are these guys? This is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. But it fit, the energy of it fit the skateboarding so well. And then I think as soon as that video came out, instantly every skateboarder was like, I got to have a Sonic Youth cassette. And I think that both things kind of owe each other, in that sense, that there were probably a lot of people that started off into music, and then their buddy rode a skateboard. So then they're like, hey, I'll get a skateboard. And then I think there were a lot of people that rode skateboards that probably still listened to their parents' music, and then started getting around their friends, and they're like, hey, I'm going to buy a Bad Brains cassette now. So I think that those two things culturally, had they not married together so well in the 1980s and all throughout the exposure that they were accustomed to, had that not been for, well, we want to borrow one of your songs and put it in a skate video. And then the next thing you know, 10 million skateboarder kids are like, got to have a Bad Brains cassette, got to have a Agent Orange, Descendants. There was a lot of the Vision Skate videos had Descendants music in it.
Yeah.
In fact, the first time I ever heard Operation Ivy was at the end of a skate video, and it's like, who are these guys? And I didn't know ska music from polka at that point. And so I think that yeah, if I could say, if it wasn't for skateboarding, there's a lot of things about me that wouldn't be. But I would certainly say that if it wasn't for the gift of skateboarding, my taste in music would probably be far different.
Awesome. That's a great way to correlate between the two. That it is a culture that one feeds off the other.
Yes, definitely. And I think the attitude of, there's been this big eternal question, what is punk rock music, and what is punk rock music, and then what is punk rock, as two separate things.
Yeah.
And I've always felt like punk rock, to me, it's about an attitude of personal freedom, and this notion that I don't really care if the general public is affected by anything that I'm doing as a person. I just want to be left the hell alone to do it and not be judged or beat up over it.
Yeah.
And I think that that core attitude, it bleeds over into music, but not just punk, of jazz music, like, like Coltrane, for example, John Coltrane. There were a lot of people in the jazz community at that time that were like, this is crap. This guy's totally just like, this isn't jazz music. What's he doing? And I think that in a way, John Coltrane sticking to being John Coltrane is also a very punk rock attitude. So to me, that is probably the main marriage of skateboarding and music in general, is this idea that this is very much a personal trip for me. Don't really care if anybody else thinks it's cool or likes it. This is something that's inside of me. I have to do it. And if I don't do it, I'm gonna lose my fucking mind.
Yeah.
So I like that connection of the two. And I've always sort of been a stubborn, slightly rebellious person. So the idea that I could have these two things that I'm so comfortable with, that encompasses the idea of, yes, be rebellious, be yourself, try the crazy thing. I just can't imagine life any other way now. so
That's awesome. That's awesome. So back to your music, it is very apparent that punk rock has influenced King Ghidorah, because I heard the slightly dirty guitars mixed with the melody, which has got a lot of reverb. It's a unique sound. Was that intentional, or was it kind of like a happy accident?
I would say truthfully, I think it started out as a happy accident, and then became and then it sort of morphed into an intentional thing. The band that I had before King Ghidora was called the Jupiter Satellite, and we were kind of a psychedelic space rock. I don't even actually know, all these years later, still what you would actually call it. But it was kind of like if you could take Built to Spill, Sonic Youth, and elements of punk rock and mesh them together. That was our sound. But I wanted, in that band, the idea in mind was that even though there's no sound in outer space, because space is a vacuum, you always kind of picture, at least most people do, that it's outer space is this gigantic echoey, like a gigantic reverb tank, basically.
Yeah.
So I wanted the guitar to sound like it was being blasted through the cosmos. Once I started doing King Ghidora, I realized, I want that sound, but I also want the surf guitar sound. And there's got to be a way to land in the middle of those two things and have a guitar sound that can be crunchy when it needs to be and kind of dirty, but can also, when it needs to be, can be soft and very nice and beautiful, like a surf guitar is supposed to sound. So I think it started out a happy accident, and then very much became a thing of like, no, this can be done. You can have reverb, you can have a slapback echo, and you can run an overdrive into all of that. And as long as you know how to control it, you can get a pretty decent sound out of it. So, yeah. But also I would point out as a side note that a lot of the early surf music, a lot of those guitars were actually overdriven as well, because they were, they're playing through 30, 40 watt amps, and those amps, when you turn them up, especially the tube amps, they get a little dirty. And then the reverb tanks themselves, especially the Fender tanks, those are tube driven as well. So after they've been on for 5 or 10 minutes, those guys kind of start to act like a little bit of a preamp. But I think when you factor in the kind of crappy recording quality that existed when a lot of those early surf bands came about, I think if they had been recorded with better technology, I guess, for lack of a better term, you probably would have been able to tell that, wow, these guitars are actually a little dirty sounding. But I think what you ended up with at the end, the finished product made it sound a lot of the times like, wow, that guitar is really clean. It just has a lot of reverb. And I think some of those guys, that's how they did it. But I think there are other bands that they actually did have kind of an overdriven driving tone to the guitar. So yeah, I think that that's a sensitive argument in surf music, whether distortion and overdrive belongs. And I would agree that there's a thin line there where maybe it gets to where the guitar sound is starting to just sound like an instrumental punk rock band that uses reverb. So there's a thin line there, but as far as King Ghidora's sound, it needs it. I've tried it both ways. I've tried it just with the twin reverb cranked and a lot of, the reverb cranked, and it ends up missing a little bit of the muscle that it needs. Yeah. So that's why I go that route.
I think you've achieved what you were going for, because like you said, it's a fine line, but you've achieved a delicate balance, which is really cool. This is why I like it so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. On the album that's going to be released this year, the Lost King Ghidora record, I actually on that recording I actually made a more conscious effort to try and get more of a traditional surf guitar sound. And so, myself and my friend Jasper, who is also kind of I don't want to say our engineer, but he's a sound technician, engineer, and he helps us with our recordings, and then he does all the mixing and mastering. He was the one that suggested to me, hey, maybe on this newer batch of tunes, maybe you should back off the overdrive a little bit, because these newer songs, they're a lot more surfy sounding than the last record. And maybe it would be an interesting offset in your guys's catalog to have one record where it's like, wow, they actually kind of went with more of a traditional surf sound on this, And so when that album finally does come out, if anyone does actually buy it, that they'll probably notice right away, like, wow, he kind of toned back the guitar sound a little bit. But the idea was to just do that on the recording. Live, the new songs live, they're still very much overdriven guitars, a bigger, heavier sound. And also, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, how do you feel about how that record turned out in a more traditional sense?
I like it. I like it a lot. What's weird is I would say about four songs in, because with this record it was during the quarantine phase of the pandemic, and the three of us, myself and DB Inferno, aka Dustin Bean, and then Keith of the Moon, aka Anthony DeRocco, the three of us had decided, because at the time the band was, just like every other band, it was like everything's going good. You got all this momentum, and you wake up one morning and the universe has flipped the switch off on everything.
Yeah.
And at that time we were feeling really, really pumped up and like, wow, things are moving right along. And so when the quarantine hit, for the first month, we didn't do anything. No band practices, no nothing, because obviously we were worried about each other, worried about our families. In the early days of that, nobody knew what was going on. So the band was kind of put on hold. And then I would say about 3 months into the quarantine, we had this kind of group text chain going, and we were all chatting one day, and I said, I really need to play some music. I know we're not going to play any shows obviously for a while, but I'm like jonesing to play some music. And here's all the precautions that Rama, my wife Rama, and I have been taking. Is that I was doing the whole thing. Practically wearing a spacesuit to go out to get groceries, and then coming home and stripping on the front porch and cleaning all the groceries. Doing every possible thing to keep safe. And then we all kind of realized, oh, we're all doing that. We're all doing that. So even though it was considered dangerous at the time, we said, let's get together and have a band practice, and we'll do masks and we'll do the whole thing. And so we had a couple of band practices where we tried to do the masks, and then it was like we go out front to have a cigarette and the masks come off, and then you go back in the band room and you forget you haven't put the mask back on, and then an hour later it's like, oh, and you put the mask back on. But anyways, we had decided, we don't want to stop, and who knows, maybe naively we thought maybe in a month or two this will just, it's over. So let's take this downtime and do something that we've never done before, which is let's write a record. The previous record was, the songs were kind of written in blocks. I would come up with a new song and then another one would pop up, and so they were kind of written in twos. And with those songs, the idea was never that we needed an album. It was that we need a full set of music to be able to play. And of course, we can compile those and make an album. And then somewhere along the way with the previous record, we realized, wow, this is a record. Even though the songs were written in blocks, they all kind of seem to follow a theme, some sort of running theme. And so, okay, let's throw them together and start to put out a record. But with this one, it was the first time where we sat down with no new songs on the books and just said, okay, let's just see what happens. And I think that there are things about this new record that people will like, because in that sense of we sat down and wrote this time without any preconceived notion. There's a couple of things in there that we might not have done on the previous record. And also, I think this was the first time in a very long time where the three of us kind of just fleshed out the songs together. With the previous record, a lot of the songs would come to the table from my end kind of already roughly structured, and I would go to those guys and say, okay, so I have this song and here's how I've been playing it, and I would show it to those guys, and then we would write out on paper, like we would name the parts, so we'd have intro, and then we'd have first movement, and then we'd have the rocking part, and then the surf section, and we would literally flesh it out on paper. Okay, intro, 2 bars, so it'd say intro 2, first movement 4 bars, so it'd say move 1 4, and just have these things mapped out on paper. And then we would go through and jam on them, record them, listen to the recordings, and then inevitably there would be something that Dustin or Anthony would do that I wasn't expecting, and it was like, oh, hey, that right there, you should do that. That sounds awesome. And then we would immediately go back, focus on whatever that was, and okay, boom, so now we have this 4 extra bars of Dusty's weird bass line thing that he came up with that we're going to throw in. And hey, while we're at it, let's put that in the middle, and how about everyone stops and he plays the bass line for a minute, and then you and I kind of come in on and off, and then at the end of that we all tie in, and boom, we go. So that, those songs, the previous record, they always kind of came with a structure already sort of somewhat attached. These songs, they started out as we'd go out in the band room and just start jamming, and it's like, ooh, that's a cool little riff. So there's probably more minutes of jam recordings from this newest record that's going to come out this year than there are actual finished songs that we ended up with. Because we'd just go out there and jam for hours, and then sit, at the end of practice, sit down and play all that back. And there'd be something that we played for 10 minutes straight, and there was only 2 minutes of it, or even a minute of it, that was like, hey, I like this little section here. And so you kind of grab that section and then build something around that. So this newest record, I think that it might not be so far off from the previous record, but I think that anybody that's closely associated with the band or knows how the band works will be able to listen to that record and say, you know, I can tell that these guys did something a little different on this record, and hopefully not in a bad way. That that is yet to be determined. But either way, yes, I'm very excited about the new record. I hope that everyone else is as well when they hear it. And if not, then we'll just go from there, I guess.
Well, I'm certainly excited to hear it. Just your writing style is and the melodies, it kind of hits home for me, being so into surf music, but also punk rock. You know, it hits both. It hits both of them for me.
Thanks, appreciate that. One of the things that one of the things that happens in the surf music world that I think probably happens in every genre where there's a discernible foundation. You know, here are the early bands that did this style of music. There's always the purist who don't want to see or hear any other version of whatever it may be, surf music, blues music. I feel like blues is another one where people get really sensitive about how you change things, you know. So I think if you're gonna be in a surf rock band, this is just my personal opinion, and as far as even mentioning the purist in the genres, I don't even care about that. They're allowed to be as purist as they want to be, and I can totally dig the approach of, you know, no, I like the old sound of the old surf music, or I like the old, you know, the original blues sound. Great, no problem. However, I do think that it becomes a problem when, like, for example, with surf music specifically, well, I feel like when a surf rock band is, I don't want to, controversial is not the right term, but when you could play it for two different types of surf music fan, and one surf music fan can say, yeah, that's surf music, that's cool, it's like it's a modern take on it, and then the other surf music fan might say that's not surf music at all. They've got some surfy licks in there, but it's not, I wouldn't call this surf music. Both of those people are right. As for us though, I feel like for me personally, it does kind of a disservice though to surf music specifically to say that it can't be more than what it is to whomever that may be, the purist or the open listener. But I think as a musician though, and as a songwriter, even if you're sticking in a genre, you've got to be true to what you want to play musically, and that's how these forms of music progress. And so I'm a sucker for a melody. I love song hooks, and so, you know, to me, there's no reason why, if you like that about music, you like the hook, the melody, whatever it is, you know, the ding ding moment and the song for you that gets you, let those moments happen, you know. And also, if you can open up a new avenue for whatever genre that you've kind of walled yourself into or been categorized as, then why not take the opportunity, especially if it feels natural. It's like, you know, a regular surf guitar player would probably play a little single note surf run thing here because that would be the thing to do. But me, I want to play a heavy octave chord melody through this part, you know, and then all of a sudden that opens up a whole new element of the song that may never have come about if you had just played it safe and gone the traditional route. So I like to, if we have a song and a melody creeps its way in that isn't necessarily surf rock, if it works for the song and it works for our ears, then we don't fight it. We let it, we let it manifest. So yeah,
Cool. Well, I want to thank you so much, Mark, for coming on the show and really giving us a detailed perspective on your music and the love for music and its place in culture. I think people are going to really dig this interview because you speak the same language as most of our listeners, is like approach music with an open mind and doing it yourself and the roots of punk rock and modern day surf music is a lot of DIY as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I think about with surf rock, when specifically when surf rock first started out, the mentality of those early surf rock bands from California especially was sort of punk rock. I mean, when the squares of the time saw these beach kids, dancing around and going crazy to this loud, crazy music, those people back then reacted, I'm sure, very much the same way that the squares in the 1980s reacted to these crazy punk rock kids, slamming into each other and hopping around to this crazy music. So for me, a lot of that early punk rock, at least in the United States, happened. Well, okay, now I'm about to get into one of those things where it's hugely debatable, but we'll say for the sake of this conversation, a lot of the Descendants, Agent Orange, Dead Kennedys, a lot of that early punk rock was also West Coast. So to me, and again, surfing, skateboarding, music culture kind of combining. And if you think about bands like Agent Orange, I mean, I would say it's not hard to argue that those guys are definitely the punk rock extension of surf music. One of the earliest incarnations of it. But anyways, to me though, those early surf rock bands, they were very much do it yourself, and they did, to me, they did have kind of that punk rock ethos or mindset of yeah, we're different and we want you to leave us alone so we can be different, and we want our little place in the world here, but we don't want you guys to come down on us for being what we are. And of course, we're never going to go to being what you folks are, so let's just go our separate ways here. So to me, that the marriage of punk rock and surf music, that already happened a long time ago, and I would say bands like bands like us, bands like Man Astro Man, bands like Daikaiju, especially.
Yeah.
That that marriage for those bands to exist. Sorry, I have 4 dogs and they're going crazy or something. That marriage already happened to me. You know what I mean? And I think it's bands like Man Astro Man, Daikaiju, Agent Orange. Those bands already kind of have proven this very much works, and it is sort of the logical future extension of both of those genres. Is that this weird in between high energy punkish kind of music that feels really great to listen to, and it feels really great to play. And especially I would say most surf rock shows that you go to, unlike at times a punk rock show, definitely at a surf rock show, you're not going to get beat up or assaulted. You know, you you might at a punk rock show, depending on what the scenario is, but you know.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And I hope out in Oregon today you have a great day. You have a full day ahead of you, and it was really interesting to hear your story and to talk to a fellow East Coaster.
East Coast, baby.
Have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Thank you
Oh,
for
no
having
problem.
me. You too, man. I appreciate it.